Hi everyone, and welcome back to Truth in Shadows. Thank you for being here. Tonight's case will shake you. A woman trusted by everyone. Two husbands dead under strange circumstances. And when suspicion turned toward her, she pointed the blame at someone no one expected, her own daughter. What really happened behind the closed doors of this quiet home? If this story pulls you in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin. Maplewood, New York, was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked and waved to neighbors from their porches. It was peaceful, uneventful, and quiet, the kind of place where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. And in the middle of this calm suburban setting was the Carter family. To anyone passing by, they looked like a picture of stability. A neat home with trimmed hedges, two children playing in the yard, and a husband and wife who smiled at church on Sundays. Rachel Carter fit the mold of the classic suburban wife. In her early 30s, she had soft brown hair that she usually tied back, simple clothes, and a calm, almost reserved way of speaking. She was the one who packed lunches, attended school meetings, and kept the house spotless. Her husband, Thomas Carter, was 38 and worked long hours as a cable technician. He was the quiet type, hard-working, dependable, and a little worn from the job. The couple had two daughters, Emily, a curious and observant 10-year-old, and Lily, just 6, full of giggles and questions. To the outside world, the Carters were ordinary, maybe even a bit boring. But inside the house, something had shifted. It began slowly. Thomas started complaining of fatigue. He would come home earlier than usual, collapse on the couch, and barely touch his dinner. He had always been active fixing things around the house, tossing a ball with the girls, but now he could barely walk up the stairs without stopping to catch his breath. He mentioned odd symptoms: his legs ached, his stomach cramped, and sometimes he felt disoriented. Rachel told friends he had the flu. She shrugged it off, saying he was just tired from work. To some, she seemed dismissive. When Thomas called in sick more than once in a week, his co-workers grew worried. But Rachel kept insisting that he just needed rest. At first, Thomas believed her. He trusted Rachel. After all, this was the woman he had shared his life with for over a decade. But his condition worsened. He began slurring his words. His hands trembled when holding a cup. His skin, usually tanned from working outdoors, turned pale and sallow. He stopped eating and dropped weight quickly. Meanwhile, Rachel's behavior didn't match that of a concerned wife. She was distant, cold even. She avoided eye contact with Thomas and often stayed out late, telling him she was visiting her sister or running errands. But there were whispers neighbors spotted her at the grocery store with another man, laughing too loudly, standing a little too close. His name was Stephen Mitchell. Stephen was a well-known figure in Maplewood. He owned a successful air conditioning repair company and drove a sleek black truck that stood out in the quiet town. Tall, broad-shouldered, and confident, Stephen had been divorced for 2 years and was known for his charm. Rumors swirled that he and Rachel had met through a repair call, and that their friendship had quickly turned into something more. People talked, but no one had proof. And Rachel denied everything. She acted offended when asked about Stephen. But when Thomas confronted her one night, barely able to stand straight, his voice weak, Rachel told him he was imagining things. That he was paranoid. That he needed sleep. Then, on the morning of January 11, 2000, the call came. Rachel dialed 911, her voice calm but urgent. She told the dispatcher her husband wasn't breathing. The paramedics arrived within minutes and found Thomas lying in bed, motionless. Rachel said she had gone to check on him and found him cold. She told the first responders that he had a history of heart problems. That he'd been sick for weeks. That maybe this was a heart attack. The paramedics noted that Rachel seemed too composed. There were no tears, no panic. Just a firm tone and a repeated insistence that Thomas didn't need to be examined too closely. When the coroner suggested an autopsy standard in a case where the cause of death wasn't immediately clear, Rachel refused. She said Thomas wouldn't have wanted it. That she didn't want his body disturbed. She signed the papers quickly, and within 72 hours, Thomas Carter was buried in the local cemetery under a modest headstone that read, "Beloved husband and father." The funeral was small. Friends gathered to hug Rachel, to comfort the children. People said kind things. He was too young. Such a tragedy. At least he's at peace now. Rachel wore black and kept her face solemn. She accepted casseroles and cards. But she didn't cry. Not once. What no one knew then, what no one even imagined, was that Thomas Carter hadn't died from a heart attack. His organs hadn't failed naturally. He hadn't simply gone to sleep and never woken up. His death had a cause. A cause that was slow, invisible, and deliberate. It would take years before someone asked the right questions. Before someone noticed that this quiet house in Maplewood had far too many secrets hidden behind its walls. And when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just change what people thought about Rachel Carter, it would change how they looked at trust, at family, and at the deadly masks people can wear every single day. Rachel Carter remarried in the spring of 2001, just 14 months after the sudden death of her first husband. Her new husband was Stephen Mitchell, a man whose name had already circulated in quiet conversations and cautious whispers throughout Maplewood. To many, the speed of the marriage was surprising. To others, it was confirmation of what they had suspected all along, that Rachel and Stephen had been more than just friends long before Thomas Carter passed away. Stephen Mitchell was not like Thomas. Where Thomas had been quiet and unassuming, Stephen was bold, confident, and meticulous. He ran his own successful air conditioning repair business, and he was known in the area as someone who got things done. He dressed sharply, drove a new black pickup truck, and spoke with authority. Some found him intimidating, others respected him, but few could deny that he lived with purpose. When Rachel moved into Stephen's home, a two-story house on the edge of Maplewood, with a well-manicured lawn and tall hedges, it was seen as a step up. The house was larger, the neighborhood quieter, and her lifestyle more comfortable. She no longer had to pinch pennies or worry about the monthly bills. Emily and Lily now had their own rooms, and Rachel had a new beginning. But not everything inside that house was as perfect as it seemed. At first, Stephen tried to play the role of stepfather. He attended school events, offered help with homework, and tried to bond with Emily, who was now 11. But Emily wasn't like her little sister. She was observant and sharp. She remembered her father's slow decline, and although no one had said it aloud, she felt something about it wasn't right. Now, with a new man in her house, one who was strict and had little patience for questions, Emily kept her distance. The relationship between Stephen and Emily quickly turned cold. He expected discipline, structure, and obedience, things Emily resisted. She missed her father's calm presence, his gentle encouragement, and she resented the way Stephen seemed to take over everything. Rachel often sided with Stephen during arguments, and Emily felt more isolated with each passing month. Rachel's relationship with Stephen, meanwhile, began to shift behind closed doors. At family gatherings or neighborhood barbecues, she would smile and lean into him, but at home, she complained. To close friends, she said Stephen was too demanding, cold, and never affectionate. She painted a picture of a man who treated her more like a housekeeper than a wife. She never mentioned the money, though the money was what made everything worth tolerating. Stephen, for his part, was growing suspicious. He was no fool, and he noticed subtle changes in Rachel's behavior. She was often on her phone late at night. She would disappear for hours during the day, claiming she was running errands, but coming home with nothing to show for it. She became defensive when asked simple questions, snapping at Stephen and accusing him of not trusting her. Then there were the sightings. Employees at Stephen's company noticed that Rachel had grown especially close to one of the younger technicians, a man in his late 20s named Jake. He was friendly, easygoing, and always seemed to linger whenever Rachel came by the office. She brought him coffee once. Another time, someone saw them talking in the parking lot, standing unusually close. No one dared confront Rachel or Jake directly. After all, Jake was just a tech, and Rachel was the boss's wife. But the rumors started spreading slowly, then faster. Stephen heard them too. At first, he tried to brush them off. He didn't want to believe his wife would betray him. But doubts crept in. He began paying closer attention to her schedule, checking credit card receipts, watching her movements more carefully. What he found only deepened his suspicions. There were unexplained charges on their bank statements, dinners at restaurants he had never visited, hotel bookings cancelled at the last minute, and small, strange purchases that didn't make sense. One day, Stephen opened the glove box of Rachel's car and found a pair of sunglasses he didn't recognize, obviously too large to be hers. When he asked about them, Rachel shrugged and said they probably belonged to a friend. But Stephen didn't believe her. He started confiding in a close friend, a man he'd known since high school. During a fishing trip in early summer 2005, Stephen admitted he was thinking about separating from Rachel. He talked about her mood swings, her distance, and the growing mountain of evidence that pointed to something or someone else. "She's hiding something," he said. "And I don't like the way she looks at that Jake guy." Stephen also mentioned that he was thinking about changing his will. Currently, Rachel was the sole beneficiary of a life insurance policy worth over $250,000. It had seemed like a practical decision when they got married. Rachel had 2 young daughters, and he wanted to make sure they were cared for if anything happened to him. But now, it didn't feel right. "I need to protect myself," he said. But he would never get the chance. Sometime in the weeks that followed that conversation, things inside the Mitchell home grew more tense. Stephen became quiet and withdrawn. He stopped inviting friends over. He began locking his briefcase, keeping important papers in his truck instead of the home office. And Rachel became strangely sweet. She began making Stephen's favorite meals again. She poured his drinks before he asked. She sat next to him on the couch in the evenings, brushing his arm lightly, asking if he wanted another glass of wine. At first, Stephen was suspicious. The sudden shift in her behavior didn't make sense. But over time, he seemed to let his guard down. He started sleeping better. He told his friend that maybe things were finally improving. Maybe she just needed time, he said. But what Stephen didn't know was that the shift in Rachel's behavior was not a sign of renewed love, it was a warning. In late July 2005, Stephen became ill. It started with nausea and muscle aches, followed by intense abdominal pain. He told Rachel he thought he had food poisoning. She suggested rest and offered to make him soup. He stayed home from work, and she took care of him, bringing him tea, making sure he stayed hydrated. But Stephen didn't get better. In fact, his condition worsened quickly. Within days, he could barely walk. He was sweating profusely, his speech slurred, and he often seemed confused. Still, Rachel did not take him to the hospital. She told neighbors he had the flu and that she was keeping an eye on him. She turned away visitors and told the children to keep quiet while Daddy gets some rest. One morning in early August, an employee stopped by the house to drop off work documents. He later recalled seeing Rachel through the window, sitting at the kitchen table while Stephen struggled to move across the living room. The employee said it didn't look like Rachel was helping, she just watched. By mid-August, Stephen's condition had deteriorated. He was bedridden, unable to eat, and barely conscious. Rachel called 911 on the morning of August 22, 2005. Her voice was calm as she told the dispatcher that her husband had locked himself in the bedroom and wasn't responding. When police and paramedics arrived, they found the bedroom door locked from the inside. They forced it open and discovered Stephen Mitchell lying unresponsive on the bed. He was surrounded by vomit. On the nightstand was a greenish liquid in a half-empty glass, and nearby was an open container of antifreeze. Rachel told the officers she had found him like that and assumed he had taken his own life. What followed next would shake the foundation of what everyone believed about Rachel Carter. But in that moment, as Stephen's lifeless body was taken from the house, Rachel stood quietly in the hallway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Neighbors again whispered words of comfort. They said things like "poor woman" and "she can't catch a break." No one dared imagine that Rachel Carter had just buried her second husband in 5 years. No one suspected that both deaths would soon be connected. And no one, not even the officers standing in that hallway, knew that Rachel's past was about to catch up with her. And this time, she wouldn't be able to bury the truth. It was a quiet Monday morning in Maplewood when Rachel Carter picked up the phone and calmly dialed 911. There was no panic in her voice, no trembling, no urgency. She spoke with the ease of someone reporting a power outage or a missing pet. She told the dispatcher that her husband, Stephen Mitchell, had locked himself in their bedroom the previous night and hadn't emerged since. She said she thought he was just upset, probably needed some time alone, and she hadn't wanted to disturb him. But something about the tone of her voice felt off, too composed, too flat. Most people calling about an unresponsive loved one sounded frantic or terrified. Rachel sounded resigned. When the police arrived at the Mitchell home, the scene was unsettling even before they stepped inside. The front lawn was perfectly trimmed, the flowers by the porch freshly watered. The house stood in complete silence, the kind of silence that seemed forced, like it was trying too hard to appear normal. Rachel greeted the officers at the door. She was dressed in a plain gray sweater and jeans. Her hair was tied back. Her face showed no signs of distress, no tears, no red eyes, no visible signs of someone who believed her husband might be dead behind a locked door. She pointed upstairs and said, "He's in there. I haven't heard a sound since last night." The bedroom door was indeed locked from the inside. The officers knocked and called Stephen's name, but there was no response. Finally, they forced the door open. What they saw made the room feel colder than it actually was. Stephen Mitchell lay motionless on the bed, face turned slightly to the side. His body was stiff, the color drained from his skin. There was vomit on his shirt and the bed sheets. On the nightstand beside him was a glass containing a thick, greenish liquid. It looked like something artificial, almost neon in color. Near the edge of the table sat a partially open bottle of antifreeze. The room smelled faintly chemical, a mix of sweet and bitter that hung in the air longer than it should have. A laptop sat on the desk across the room, screen still glowing, a document left open. One of the officers glanced at it. It was a letter. A suicide note. The note was typed, not handwritten. It was short and vague. Stephen supposedly wrote that he had been depressed, that he couldn't go on living with guilt, and that he was responsible for something terrible, something no one else knew about. What shocked the detectives, however, was the part where he claimed to have poisoned Thomas Carter, Rachel's first husband. This claim immediately raised questions. Stephen had barely known Thomas. Their lives had barely overlapped. They had no documented history of contact, no obvious connection. Why would Stephen take responsibility for a man's death that happened more than 5 years earlier, before he had even married Rachel? And then there was the strange fact that the note was typed. Not signed. Not printed. Just, open, sitting on a screen. No fingerprints on the keyboard, no signs of recent typing. It looked planted. Artificial. Like something written by someone trying to make it look like a suicide note, without understanding what a real one should sound like. Detectives began looking closer at the details. The room had no signs of struggle. The door was locked from the inside, Yes, but it was a simple push lock that could be secured with a thin object and easily manipulated. There were no visible injuries on Stephen's body, no cuts, no bruises. Just the green liquid and the antifreeze bottle, a scene that felt staged, like a play frozen mid-act. Rachel, when questioned, gave a clear, controlled statement. She said Stephen had been drinking the night before. That he had seemed off for days. That he had been under stress from work and felt like a failure. She told them she had gone to bed early and hadn't seen him since. She assumed he needed space, and she respected that. But her version of events began to unravel quickly. People who knew Stephen described him differently. Yes, he was serious, maybe a little intense, but he wasn't unstable. He didn't drink much, rarely even touched alcohol, and had never spoken about depression or guilt. His employees said he'd been planning new contracts, working on expanding the business. Friends said he had recently mentioned redoing his will and possibly separating from Rachel, but suicide? That made no sense. The autopsy results made things even stranger. Stephen had extremely high levels of ethylene glycol in his system. Ethylene glycol is a chemical commonly found in antifreeze. It's colorless, odorless, and has a sweet taste. It causes severe damage to the kidneys, liver, and nervous system when ingested. If untreated, it leads to a slow, painful death. But here's the detail that stood out most: the poison had been consumed over several days. This wasn't a sudden overdose or one-time event. The levels in Stephen's body suggested multiple doses, given gradually, possibly mixed into drinks or food. That timeline didn't match the story Rachel had told about Stephen locking himself in the room overnight and suddenly ending his life. The evidence pointed to something far more deliberate. Detectives revisited the laptop and found no sign that Stephen had written the suicide note. No drafts, no login history, no metadata connecting the file to his user account. The document had been opened, but it didn't show who created it or when. But the file had been last modified while Rachel was home alone. Then came the forensics. Stephen's fingerprints were not on the glass or the antifreeze bottle. Only Rachel's prints were found. She claimed she had touched the bottle while cleaning earlier, that she had tried to move it away from Stephen once. But her explanation felt forced, and the timing didn't add up. Rachel also made a mistake in her story. She told detectives she had no idea what antifreeze smelled like. But during the questioning, she used the term sweet-smelling, something that was not public knowledge at the time and something the medical examiner hadn't yet disclosed. Detectives started to see a different picture, one of a woman who was calm, calculated, and possibly capable of far more than they initially believed. The investigation grew deeper. Detectives interviewed employees from Stephen's company, including the young technician named Jake who had once been close to Rachel. He admitted they had gone out for drinks once or twice but denied anything more. Still, his nervousness and vague answers suggested there had been something personal. He said Rachel often complained about Stephen, said she felt trapped and unappreciated. Then came the financial records. Stephen had a $250,000 life insurance policy, with Rachel as the sole beneficiary. The paperwork showed that the policy had been updated shortly after their marriage, naming her as the only recipient in the event of his death. Rachel had already begun contacting the insurance company, asking about the steps to collect the funds. She made the first inquiry just 3 days after Stephen's death. Detectives now had motive, opportunity, and evidence that contradicted Rachel's version of events. But they needed more. They needed a connection, something that could link this suspicious death to Rachel's past. And so, they did what few had considered: they looked back at the death of Thomas Carter, her first husband. What they found there would crack the case wide open. But in August 2005, that part of the story was still waiting to be discovered. For now, Rachel Carter remained a grieving widow for the second time. She accepted condolences, stayed out of the public eye, and told friends she just wanted to move forward. But the police weren't done with her. Not by a long shot. And as they started digging into her past, they would find that this quiet woman from Maplewood had left behind a trail of questions that no amount of sympathy could cover. It had been almost a year since Stephen Mitchell's strange and sudden death, and yet the questions surrounding it had only multiplied. The local police, now working closely with forensic experts and state investigators, were slowly pulling apart every detail of the case. The inconsistencies in Rachel's story, the typed suicide note, the chemical evidence, they all pointed in one direction. But suspicion wasn't enough. Not for an arrest. Not yet. So the investigators took a bold and controversial step. In early 2006, a court order was quietly issued to exhume the body of Thomas Carter, Rachel's first husband. He had been dead for nearly 6 years, buried in a peaceful corner of the Maplewood Cemetery under a modest headstone that bore only his name, the dates of his birth and death, and the simple words "loving father and husband." On the morning of the exhumation, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds, a chill wind sweeping across the cemetery grounds. A small group of officials stood silently as workers carefully removed the soil, the only sounds being the low hum of machinery and the distant rustling of leaves. There were no reporters, no onlookers, just quiet determination. When Thomas's remains were finally recovered and sent for examination, the forensic team worked with precision. The key was to find any trace of chemicals that could point to poisoning, and specifically, signs of ethylene glycol. This would not be easy. Years had passed, and the breakdown of organic matter made detection difficult. But ethylene glycol has a fingerprint. It leaves behind chemical crystals, tiny, needle-shaped structures in the organs, especially in the kidneys. If those crystals were still present, they would shine under the microscope like silent witnesses to a hidden truth. Days later, the results came in. The report confirmed what some investigators had feared, and what others had dared not believe: Thomas Carter did not die of natural causes. His body showed clear signs of ethylene glycol poisoning. The presence of oxalate crystals in his kidneys was unmistakable. The damage to his internal organs matched the same pattern seen in Stephen Mitchell. The symptoms Rachel had described years earlier, fatigue, stomach pain, confusion, they now read like a checklist of toxic exposure. It hadn't been a heart attack. It had been murder. Rachel Carter had now lost 2 husbands in eerily similar ways, both within the walls of their own homes, both while supposedly under her care, and both showing the same hidden cause of death. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was the link. Detectives revisited the case files from 2000. They reviewed Rachel's statements from the night Thomas died. They looked again at the fact that she had refused an autopsy. That she had rushed the funeral. That she had never expressed shock, or demanded answers, or shown the grief most spouses would. It had all seemed odd at the time, but now it felt calculated. Chilling. Still, the legal system required more than suspicion, more than pattern. Investigators needed something concrete, something to show Rachel had access to the poison, had motive, and most importantly, had intent. Then, something happened that none of them expected. Rachel's behavior changed. Until this point, she had been cooperative but distant. She answered questions politely but cautiously. She stayed away from the media, kept her daughters close, and tried to maintain the appearance of normal life. But now, she began focusing her attention in a new, strange direction: her older daughter, Emily. Emily had grown from a quiet child into a thoughtful, somewhat reserved teenager. At 17, she was preparing for college, working a part-time job, and spending most of her time away from home. She and Rachel had never been particularly close, and in the years since Stephen's death, their relationship had become strained. But suddenly, Rachel seemed determined to rebuild that connection. She started inviting Emily to go shopping, offering to take her out to eat, asking her to spend more time at home. She bought her new clothes, surprised her with small gifts, even framed old family photos to put in Emily's room. She told her daughter she wanted to make up for lost time, to heal the past. At first, Emily was cautious but touched. Like any teenager, she wanted her mother's approval. She wanted a peaceful home. So she agreed. She began spending more evenings at the house, sharing meals, sitting with Rachel in the living room, watching old movies they used to enjoy when she was a kid. Then came the drinks. Rachel began offering Emily special drink smoothies, milkshakes, tea with honey. She said they were for her stress, to help her sleep better. Emily didn't think much of it. Her mother had always been the one to take care of her when she was sick. It felt comforting, familiar. Until it didn't. One evening in early fall, Emily came home from work feeling tired. Rachel greeted her warmly and handed her a tall glass of something cold and sweet. Emily drank it without question. But within an hour, she felt dizzy. Her vision blurred. Her stomach churned. She tried to stand but stumbled. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, but everything began to fade. The next thing she remembered was waking up in a hospital bed. Bright lights. A beeping monitor. N4 in her arm. A nurse by her side. Emily had survived but just barely. The doctors told her she had overdosed on a combination of sleeping pills and alcohol. It was a miracle she had been found in time. Someone, presumably Rachel, had called 911, saying she had found Emily unconscious on her bed, a bottle of pills nearby and a letter folded on the pillow. It looked like a suicide attempt. But something wasn't right. Emily, still weak and confused, denied ever writing the letter. She couldn't remember taking the pills. She remembered the drink. She remembered feeling tired. Then, nothing. She asked where the letter had come from. No one could say. Detectives arrived soon after. They had already begun to suspect Rachel of 2 murders. Now, it seemed, she might have tried a third this time, her own daughter. The suicide note became critical evidence. It was typed, just like Stephen's. It claimed Emily was responsible for both her father's and stepfather's deaths. That she had poisoned them out of rage. That she couldn't live with the guilt. It sounded like a confession, but not in Emily's voice. The language was too formal. Too detached. The note had been typed on a computer, Rachel's computer. Forensic experts examined the file metadata. The document had been created on Rachel's device, during a time when Emily wasn't home. Rachel claimed Emily had used her computer sometimes, that she had no idea what her daughter had been writing. But the timeline didn't support that. When Emily was stable enough, detectives interviewed her in depth. She cried as she explained what she remembered. That her mother had been unusually kind. That she had trusted her. That she had no reason to think the drink was dangerous. That she had never written the note. And that she would never try to take her own life. Suddenly, the story changed. Rachel Carter was no longer just the grieving widow of 2 unlucky men. She was now suspected of attempting to frame her teenage daughter for the very crimes she may have committed. To cover her tracks. To erase the last threat to her freedom. The picture that formed was chilling. A woman who had likely poisoned her first husband to escape a fading marriage. Who had repeated the act with her second husband when he became suspicious. And who, when investigators started closing in, tried to make it look like her daughter had done it all and taken her own life in despair. Rachel Carter had built her life around secrets. But now, one by one, they were being uncovered. And the deeper the investigators dug, the more disturbing the truth became. And Emily, Rachel's own daughter, was the one person standing in the way of that truth being buried forever. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic proof, eyewitness statements, digital trails all pointed to Rachel. The final betrayal, aimed at her own daughter, had become the key to unlocking everything she had done. Rachel Carter was arrested on multiple charges, including the attempted murder of Emily Carter, and the murders of Thomas Carter and Stephen Mitchell. She showed little emotion as she was taken into custody. Her mugshot captured a woman whose expression was blank, unreadable, as if she still believed she could control how the story would be told. But this time, her lies weren't enough. The walls had closed in, and the truth was no longer hers to bury. In early 2008, Rachel Carter, once seen as a composed suburban mother and twice widowed wife, walked into a courtroom wearing handcuffs and a prison jumpsuit. The public seats were filled. Journalists lined the back wall with notepads and recorders. Family members, neighbors, former co-workers, and complete strangers who had followed the case for years came to witness what had become one of the most disturbing and complex criminal cases in Maplewood's history. Rachel sat still as the charges were read aloud: first-degree murder of Thomas Carter, first-degree murder of Stephen Mitchell, and attempted murder of her daughter, Emily Carter. The courtroom was silent, heavy with tension. Rachel didn't flinch. Her eyes remained fixed ahead, hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. Some said it was the look of control. Others saw it as the absence of remorse. The prosecution opened the trial with a narrative that would send chills through the courtroom. They painted a picture of premeditation, manipulation, and the calculated dismantling of her own family. Rachel Carter, they argued, had created a mask of the dutiful wife, the grieving widow, the concerned mother. But behind that mask was someone cold, selfish, and ruthlessly strategic. They began with the death of Thomas Carter in 2000. Witnesses described how Thomas had grown sick over time, how Rachel insisted it was stress or the flu, how she discouraged medical visits, and how she refused an autopsy after his death. The prosecutor showed the results from the exhumation: the kidney damage, the presence of oxalate crystals, the unmistakable signs of ethylene glycol poisoning. They explained how antifreeze, with its sweet taste and slow-acting toxicity, could easily be slipped into drinks without notice, causing fatal damage over days or weeks. The timeline, the symptoms, and Rachel's behavior all pointed in one direction. But that was only the beginning. They moved to Stephen Mitchell's death in 2005. The similarities were striking: sudden illness, strange symptoms, a locked bedroom, and a suicide note that made little sense. But this time, forensic evidence was more advanced. They had the glass from Stephen's nightstand, the open antifreeze bottle, and most importantly, the suicide note typed on Rachel's computer. Not a single fingerprint of Stephen's was found on the keyboard or the glass. The prosecution emphasized the financial motive. Rachel stood to gain $250,000 in life insurance after Stephen's death. She had called the insurance company just days after he died, already beginning the claims process. This wasn't the behavior of a grieving wife. It was the behavior of someone who had planned for the outcome. But the most devastating part of the case came next. Emily Carter, now 18, took the stand. She was visibly nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. But as she began to speak, her voice, though soft, carried a weight that silenced the entire room. She told the jury everything. About her relationship with her mother. About the night Rachel handed her the strange drink. About waking up in the hospital and being told she had tried to end her own life. Emily described the horror of reading the fake suicide note. The confusion. The betrayal. And then she looked across the courtroom, directly at her mother, and said, "She didn't just try to kill me. She tried to erase me. Just like she erased my father. Just like she erased Stephen. I think she wanted to be the only one left standing." Her words struck hard. People in the courtroom wiped their eyes. Some stared at Rachel, waiting for a reaction. She gave none. The defense struggled to counter the avalanche of evidence. They argued that Rachel had no prior criminal record. That she was a caring mother who had suffered great loss. That the deaths were tragic coincidences, and that the note on Emily's bed could have been written by someone else. but their arguments felt weak against the mountain of data, witness statements, and digital proof. The prosecution called forensic experts to the stand. They demonstrated how both deaths followed the same pattern: slow poisoning with antifreeze, misdirection to suggest natural causes or suicide, and Rachel's fingerprints, figurative and literal, left behind in both cases. The court heard how she had used the same language structure in both fake suicide notes, both typed, not handwritten, both too polished to be genuine. The metadata from the files didn't lie. Both documents had been created on Rachel's personal laptop, saved under her user profile, at times when no one else was home. Perhaps the most telling moment came when a forensic linguist compared the phrasing in the suicide notes to Rachel's own emails and messages. The overlap was undeniable. Her sentence structures, her choice of words, even her tendency to double space after periods, each small detail built the case against her. In closing arguments, the prosecutor didn't shout. He didn't dramatize. He simply laid out the facts, step by step, quietly but firmly. She killed her husband, then her second husband, and when the truth started catching up, she turned on her own daughter. And still, she sat in this courtroom and gave us no apology, no explanation, no sorrow. This wasn't an accident. This was method. This was survival. This was evil. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. On a rainy afternoon in March 2009, Rachel Carter stood to hear the verdict. The judge's voice was steady as he read the decision. Guilty on all counts. Rachel showed no visible emotion. No tears, no gasps. Just a slight tilt of her head, as if listening to a weather report. For a moment, the entire room remained still. Then, slowly, people exhaled. The sentencing came days later. The judge, stern but composed, looked directly at Rachel and said, "You have shown a disturbing pattern of cold and calculated violence. Your actions robbed your children of a father, and nearly cost your daughter her life. You planned these crimes. You executed them carefully. And you tried to manipulate the narrative at every turn. There is no room for leniency." Rachel Carter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was transferred to a maximum security women's facility, where she remained for the rest of her life. Guards described her as quiet, solitary. She rarely interacted with other inmates. She kept to herself. She read books, worked in the prison library, and never spoke about her crimes. In 2016, after serving just 7 years of her life sentence, Rachel was found unresponsive in her cell. The cause of death was ruled natural heart failure. She passed away alone, with no visitors, no letters, and no one to claim her remains. She was cremated, and her ashes were never collected. Emily Carter, meanwhile, moved out of Maplewood. She changed her last name. She started college and slowly began to rebuild her life. In interviews years later, she said she would never fully recover, but she hoped her story would help others recognize the signs of quiet danger. That sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones who wear the best masks. Rachel Carter's trial didn't just close a criminal case. It revealed the terrifying truth that evil can wear a mother's smile, cook your dinner, and kiss you goodnight. And that behind some of the calmest faces are the darkest secrets waiting to be uncovered. Sometimes the most dangerous people aren't strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes, they're the ones sitting across the dinner table. They smile warmly, they speak softly, they kiss their children goodnight, and behind all of it, they hide something unthinkable. Rachel Carter didn't wear a mask of cruelty or chaos. She wore a mask of normalcy. Of motherhood. Of grief. And for years, that mask fooled everyone around her. Her neighbors described her as polite, quiet, even sweet. Her co-workers said she was efficient, always organized, never made a fuss. Her daughters knew a version of her that sang lullabies and packed school lunches. But behind that calm exterior was a woman capable of orchestrating not one, not two, but three deliberate acts of destruction, each carefully planned, each rooted in a chilling sense of control. The poison she used was silent. It worked slowly, over time, eating away at the body while Rachel carried on as if nothing was wrong. She made dinner while her husbands weakened. She smiled while they struggled to breathe. She comforted her children while secretly preparing the next lie. What made her story so terrifying wasn't the method, it was the patience. The precision. The ability to sit in a room with someone she loved, knowing they were dying, and choosing to do nothing. Rachel's manipulations didn't stop at the bodies she left behind. When suspicion began to rise, she didn't panic. She planned. She turned her attention to her own daughter, the one person who still stood between her and the truth. She gave Emily a poisoned drink. She placed a typed letter next to her bed. And she called 911 with the same calm voice she had used before. As if erasing Emily was just another part of the story she was writing for herself. But the human spirit is unpredictable. Emily survived. And with her survival came the unraveling of everything Rachel had spent years constructing. The courtroom, the evidence, the testimony, it all pulled back the curtain. People who once defended Rachel were forced to face a horrifying reality: they had been wrong. The woman they had comforted at funerals, the mother they had admired, was the very person behind the deaths. The community felt betrayed, but perhaps no one more than her daughter, who had to find the strength to testify against the person who gave her life and then tried to take it away. In many ways, this case wasn't just about murder. It was about control. Rachel didn't lash out in a moment of rage. She didn't make a mistake. Everything she did was intentional, built on the belief that she could shape her own narrative. That she could decide who lived, who died, and who got blamed. It was a kind of control that went beyond physical harm. It dug into the emotional, the psychological. It was about power. What's most chilling is how long it worked. For years, she lived among others, attending barbecues, helping with school fundraisers, chatting with neighbors on the porch. And all that time, no one truly knew her. She had mastered the art of pretending, of performing. Until, finally, one survivor pulled the mask off. And that's what makes the story so important. It reminds us that darkness doesn't always look like we expect. That evil can be dressed in warmth and good manners. That truth doesn't always shout, it whispers, waits, and relies on someone brave enough to listen. Today, Rachel Carter is gone. She died in prison, alone, with no visitors, no letters, no flowers. Her ashes were never claimed. Her name, once whispered with sympathy, now lives in infamy. But Emily Carter lives on. She carries the scars of what happened, but also the strength of someone who faced that darkness and spoke the truth anyway. Her testimony didn't just lead to justice, it gave voice to the silent. It gave closure to the community. And it proved that even the deepest lies can be uncovered when one person refuses to be quiet. So now, after everything you've heard, what do you think? Would you have suspected Rachel Carter? Could you have seen past the mask? Do you believe justice was truly served? We want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your perspective, your reactions, or even your questions. We read them all. And if you found this story compelling, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and most importantly, subscribe to Truth in Shadows. Because here, we tell the stories that others want to forget. We uncover the truth no matter how deep it's been buried. And we show that behind every shadow, there's a light just waiting to be turned on.